All right, what's up? Gonna be talking about why I think expensive units, expensive upgrades, and sort of in-game financial roadblocks to progression, right? Why these are all important factors of the game. Why they're, I think, pretty much needed for the game to progress at a good speed, right? Why monsters like Felina take 40 million gold to upgrade when Slime King takes like 1/45th of that, right? Why that detail is so important despite both of them being legendaries, both of them being obtainable early on. Um, yeah, so the main reason I think that this detail is good is because it incorporates strategy, especially in setups of the game, right? And what I mean by that is, let's say in the early game, I'd say, prior to Slime King, you do have access to something like a Felina, right? And you can upgrade that Felina maybe a few levels, something like level 5, or you have, an option to invest gold in something like a Kevin, right? And then, of course, you're also going to be upgrading Speedy Mighty, you're going to have stuns, yada yada, all that stuff. And so now this basically presents you with the situation where, okay, in the levels that I'm playing, is Felina doing enough damage to consistently kill stuff faster than Kevin is? As Felina has a full map utility, right? Whereas Kevin is just single damage, but you can get him to a higher damage amount, right? And so this, especially in the early game, creates strategy, right? Because now you're stuck. Now you have to consider the HP of enemies. You have to consider what specific state levels you're gonna have trouble on, what specific waves you're gonna have trouble on running that setup. And whether it's worth it to format your setup to have a backline Felina carry or a frontline Kevin carry. Your stuns will generally stay the same. Your utility will generally stay the same. But now there's that extra added layer of consideration for whether or not you should play one carry or the other. And this also applies to stuff like Crispy. This also applies to units like Mythics, right? Do you want to go with that level 10 to level 15 Mythic to get you through JR normal, or do you want to go with something like a Kevin, a Stackier, and Infernus, right? There's now more questions when you're thinking about building the best layout possible, when you're trying to develop a setup. And this especially ties in with the units being expensive, because let's say Felina or the Mythics was as expensive to upgrade as Kevin. Well, in that case, you could completely throw out the idea of Kevin, Stacky, and Furnace, Puffy, all those carries, right? Because then you just upgrade the stronger unit, because these units are stronger. Provided you have enough gold, they're stronger. Except in the early game, you don't have enough gold, which means that they're not going to be always stronger, which means that you do need to make considerations when developing a strong setup. And that's why I think that these units are just really, really good for making the early game a lot more fun, a lot more interesting, and a lot more complex, despite it being, this game's pretty straightforward. All you have to do, put down your units, and then idle. You just wait for the units to kill everything. And the main strategy aspect of it is, number one, freezing, but that's pretty simple. And so the other main strategy aspect is going to be building your setup, which is what I think expensive units, in contrast to cheaper units, allow you to do. If they were all same gold value, it just wouldn't be the same sort of game. And so I've talked a little bit about early game, why expensive units are important for the game there. But I think moving on to mid game is important as well, right? Like post Slime King, right? So post Slime King, post Deathbite, you're going to be looking to go for a setup that can beat nightmare levels, right? And so during this stage of the game, it's less consideration whether you should use cheap or expensive units, because I'd say in most situations, you would need to use an expensive unit for these levels anyways. And I think that's decent for the game, because it makes you like build up your setup over time. It makes you grind out the levels, right? And although grinding may not be the most fun experience, it may not be the most enjoyable thing to do in the game, I think it emphasizes that idle aspect. I think it's good for developing that stuff is gathered over time. It doesn't take you like 5 years to get stuff. Like, for example, on this account, I've played for around the time of a month, right? I've ran an auto clicker for quite a bit of that, but it still didn't take me a super long amount of time to get all these units to level 500, right? However, there was sort of a roadblock, so I couldn't just steamroll the game, right? I had to do a little bit of, planning, a little bit of level reattempts. I had to do a little bit of grinding to be able to get to this stage. It's not just play the game. Okay, I've steamrolled through the entire game. I have nothing left to do. I'm done with the game now, right? And expensive units just make it so that, the game progression speed is not to a point where it's insanely fast. You can basically like second try or first try all your levels, beat them, and move on, right? You do have to stay at a level for a little bit. You have to develop your setup for a little bit. You have to, you know, hunt for good units for a little bit. You have to do all that stuff, right? Which I think is good for the longevity of the game. It's good for the progression speed of the game. And it's good for making people, you know, not view this game as sort of like a, I guess, like very cheap game, in that the progression happens instantly, right? I think that's a rather unpopular opinion, that, you know, the progression speed is slowed down a little bit, but I think it's not slowed down to the point where the game becomes boring. You know, this is an idle game. You can just leave this on in the background, and you maybe after like a few days worth of time or a week worth of time, you'll have an expensive unit and you're ready to start progressing, and it happens at a much faster rate than you think it happened, right? And so now, you know, the final part of the game I haven't talked about is the end game, right? This is the elemental challenges. And I think in this stage, I think the ideas of expensive units are the least important, right? Because elemental challenges are basically when you have everything finished in the game, you just get your evolutions, and then that's pretty much all the progression in the game, right? I think expensive units don't really change this. They don't affect this too much, because generally in this stage of game, it's sort of like a, I would say maybe like a extra stage, not really an extra stage, right? Because it is still obtaining new monsters, it's still unlocking more content. But I think expensive units don't impact this stage of the game too much, just because when you do attempt elemental challenges anyways, and for most people up to that stage, they would have grinded a ton anyways. And again, that idea of progression not being at lightning speed comes into play here again. Just that, you know, you can't instantly steamroll the game and get done with all the content and have nothing left to do. You know, you have to put a little bit more planning into your setup, and especially with the end game setups and with, you know, the nightmare level setups. If you don't have access to an insanely high leveled unit, right, you have to do a little bit more thinking. You have to do a little bit more setup planning, right? You know, going back to the nightmare levels, you can still beat nightmare levels without maxed units, right? You just have to think a little bit more about how you're gonna create your setup, right? And so combos that are present in elemental challenges, stuff like Anubis Deathbite, you know, stuff like placing certain units at certain places. You know, for example, sometimes you put Zeus at the back so that he could hit everything. Sometimes you put him at the front to maximize his DPS. You know, sometimes you have a Jirai at a certain point on the map so you can slow stuff, right? If you have stuff at a lower level in nightmare levels, that's going to be the strategies you're employing. And in elemental challenges, it's the same sort of situation, except now they're max leveled, right? So elemental challenges are just that, you know, basically the highest degree of setup strategy, I say, for, you know, a max account. And nightmare levels are a really high level, pretty high level of setup strategy, I'd say, for an account that's close to maxing, you know, maybe a bit off of that, or, you know, around max, that sort of area, right? Maybe like level 400s and all that stuff, right? And so yeah, that's mainly why I think expensive units are overall good for the game. They incorporate strategy in the early game. They don't make progression lightning fast, and they incorporate strategy as they're pretty unique units in the later stages of the game, right? Stuff like Susanoo resummons rocks. You know, you want to see if you'd rather get easier farming, or it's necessary to use rock summons and have another unit in here to beat the level. You know, Zeus is just the idea of stunning. You have your full map units that you want to put in the back, right? You have buffing units. You know, that again, I guess there is an idea of positioning with some of these guys, right? Positioning with Hades, you know, because he does have lingering shots, and I think especially positioning with the Egyptian mythics, right? I don't have them unlocked here, but they are all pure utility, right? So because they're pure utility, you need to think about how you're going to maximize their utility, right? For example, in IQT, some people put Ra at top, some people put Ra in the middle. You know, just seeing what is more valuable, right? Getting the full immunity value, or is the immunity value not really going to be worth it in your setup for the back row, right? Or stuff like, you know, putting Anubis at a spot where Deathbite will be able to ult the units, and where maybe Zeus can take advantage of the Deathbite ults as well to finish units off. All that sort of stuff. So I think I went on a little bit of a tangent at the end there, with specific unit positioning. But yeah, just overall expensive units. I know I've said this before. I'm just gonna say it again. More strategy in the game, Progression, not lightning fast. Just strong units that I think deserve the higher gold cost. That's going to be it for this video. Like, subscribe. Let me know what you think about expensive units. Let me know what you think about the higher costs, the strategies behind using them. But yeah, if you enjoyed, like, subscribe, and see ya.